think there were basically two. One, Israel needs to restore what it calls its deterrence capacity, an expression I'll try to explain in a moment. And the second was that the Palestinians, in this case Hamas, were becoming too reasonable, too moderate, too willing to settle the conflict, and for Israel this posed a major danger, and so Hamas needed to be neutralized. Let's first look at that deterrence capacity. Around a week into the massacre, the main New York Times correspondent in the occupied territories in Israel, this fellow named Ethan Brunner, he wrote that Israel's larger concern was to reestablish Israeli deterrence because its enemies are less afraid of it than they once were or should be. To reestablish Israeli deterrence. And in fact, this concern to reestablish deterrence or to maintain this deterrence has always been a main concern of Israeli strategic doctrine. In fact, the reason we are where we are today is in no small part due to Israel's concern with what it calls its deterrence capacity. So, in June 1967, as most of you know, I assume most of you have some background in the conflict, Israel launches an attack on Egypt and then subsequently Jordan and Syria. And in the course of that attack, Israel occupies the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and also the Egyptian Sinai. And Israel put forth all of these claims about why it had to attack in June 1967. Most of you, I suspect, will be familiar with one or several of those claims. First of all, the background. In May 1967, Israel was threatening to attack Syria and in fact had laid plans to attack Syria. At that point, when Israel was about to attack Syria, the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser, he did several things. Number one, he moved some troops into the Sinai Peninsula, and then a few weeks later he announced that the Straits of Tiran would be closed to Israeli shipping, and that means the Israeli port of Eilat would not be able to receive goods. And so Israel has said, and many people believed, and some people still believe, and the media often states, that the reason Israel attacked in June 1967 was first because of that blockade of the Straits of Tiran, and secondly because of those troops that Nasser had amassed in the Sinai, which Israel said were about to be used in an attack on Israel. What does the record actually show? The record shows, first of all, Israel barely used the Straits of Tiran. About 5% of Israeli shipping went through it. About 50% of Israeli oil went through the Straits of Tiran. But Israel at the time had ample reserves of oil. And more importantly and more pertinently, the fact of the matter is there wasn't a blockade of the Straits of Tiran. Nasser declared it. Nasser was a bit too much of a blowhard, but it is a matter of fact, within days of the announced blockade of the Straits of Tiran, vessels were going through them and delivering goods. So, the claim about a blockade is simply false. Israel was fully aware that there was no blockade of the Straits of Tiran. It also knew and was fully aware that if U.S. vessels accompanied Israeli vessels, they knew that Egypt wouldn't fire. And in fact, privately, Israel acknowledged that the blockade, as they put it, was not a crucial issue. It was a secondary issue. But then what about that other claim, the one which most of you are familiar with, the one which Mr. Abba Eban, Israel's distinguished foreign minister, he famously described in his memoir as "To Live or to Die," the chapter he devotes to the June 67 war. And Israel was on the verge of extinction. This was, as Israelis like to call it, a no-choice war, and they simply preempted this potentially lethal attack. What does the record show? In fact, here we have a very extensive record, because before Israel could do anything, of course, it needed the green light, or at least the yellow light, from the United States. And so in May 1967, just before the war, Israel was sending all of its intelligence people, its military officers, its emissaries, to try to convince the United States that it had to attack. And they presented all of this information, all of this data, all of their intelligence findings, and the U.S. administration took all of the data and gave it to our meaning the U.S., intelligence agencies. There were about 6 of them. And all 6 intelligence agencies came back with the same conclusions. They said, we fed our agencies all of your data, and we keep getting 2 conclusions. Number 1, Nasser is not going to attack. And number 2, even if he were foolhardy enough to attack, even if against all probabilities he did attack, according to our data, and this is Lyndon Johnson speaking, the president at the time, he said, according to our data, you will whip the hell out of them. Well, that was the American opinion. Well, what was the Israeli opinion? In fact, we know exactly what it was, because on June 1st, a few days before the war, the head of the Israeli intelligence, foreign intelligence, the head of the Mossad, Major General Meir Amit, he comes to Washington, D.C., and he says to the Americans, and now I'm quoting him, there are no differences between the U.S. and the Israelis on the military intelligence picture or its interpretation. That is to say, the Israelis agree. Nasser is not going to attack, and even if he did, the Israeli generals have no doubt, now to quote Lyndon Johnson, that Israel would whip the hell out of them. Well, if it wasn't a blockade, because there was no blockade, and if it wasn't the threat of extinction because Nasser wasn't going to attack, then why did Israel attack in June 67? And the reason is the same reason as I'll try to show, that they attacked Gaza a few weeks ago. It was their fear of, or their need to, restore their deterrence capacity. Because there was this guy named Nasser of Egypt, and Nasser had these weird ideas. He was called back then, way before you were born, he wasn't called an Islamic fundamentalist. He was called a radical nationalist. That was the demonic term of the day. And radical nationalist, it basically means the same thing as Islamic fundamentalist means today. It means Nasser had this strange idea that the Arab people should have the right to control their own destiny. And accompanying that idea was the other strange notion that the Arab people should have the right to control their natural resources. The U.S. couldn't quite abide by that notion because it happens to be our natural resources, which by a fluke of fate happen to be buried underneath Arab soil. So there was obviously what they call in law, when a couple doesn't get along, there were irreconcilable differences. And then in May 1967, Nasser was making all of these defiant gestures announcing a blockade of the Straits of Tiran, even though there was no blockade of the Straits of Tiran.